February 14th, 1945. The skies over rural Austria erupted in a chaos of flak and fire. Sergeant Robert Hayes, a 23-year-old tail gunner from Des Moines, Iowa, felt his flying fortress shudder violently as German anti-aircraft shells tore through the fuselage. The intercom crackled with the pilot's urgent command, "Bail out." Hayes grabbed his parachute, said a prayer, and jumped into the freezing alpine air, watching his burning bomber spiral toward the snow-covered mountains below. As his chute deployed and he drifted downward, a single terrifying thought consumed him. He was descending into a countryside that American bombers had been pounding relentlessly for months. The villages below had been reduced to rubble. The people down there had every reason to hate him, to tear him apart the moment his boots touched Austrian soil. He had heard the stories, whispered in briefing rooms and barracks. Stories of downed airmen beaten by mobs, handed over to the Gestapo, or simply disappearing into the Austrian wilderness, never to be seen again. Hayes braced himself for capture, for violence, perhaps for death. What he could never have imagined was that his life would soon depend on an elderly couple whose own son had died in American hands, and that the very room where he would hide had once been a sanctuary of unexpected mercy that would now save his life. The impact came hard. Hayes crashed through the bare branches of an apple tree in a snow-dusted orchard, his parachute tangling in the limbs above him. Pain shot through his left ankle as he hit the frozen ground. He lay there for a moment, gasping, his breath forming clouds in the bitter February air. The distant rumble of artillery echoed from the east. The war was closing in on Austria from all sides. Soviet forces were pushing from the east, American and British forces from the west and south. This was a country in its death throes, and Hayes knew that made him even more vulnerable. Desperate people did desperate things. He struggled to free himself from his parachute harness, his fingers numb with cold. That was when he heard footsteps crunching through the snow. Hayes froze. His service pistol was still in its holster, but he knew drawing it would be suicide. If locals found him armed, they would have every justification to kill him on the spot. The footsteps grew closer. Through the twisted branches, Hayes saw them. An elderly man and woman, both bundled in heavy wool coats, their faces weathered by decades of alpine winters. The man carried a walking stick. The woman clutched a shawl around her shoulders. They stopped a few feet away, staring down at the American airmen tangled in their orchard. Hayes waited for the shouting, for the man to raise his stick, for the woman to run for help. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The old woman's eyes filled with tears. She said something in German that Hayes could not understand, but her tone was not angry. It was sorrowful, almost tender. The old man looked around nervously, scanning the surrounding fields and the dirt road beyond the orchard. Then he stepped forward and began helping Hayes free himself from the parachute cords. The couple's names were Johann and Greta Steinberg. They were both in their late 60s, farmers who had worked this land for more than 40 years. Their farmhouse, a sturdy alpine structure with thick stone walls and a steep pitched roof, sat at the edge of the orchard, partially hidden by a stand of pine trees. Johann supported Hayes as they made their way toward the house, the American airman limping badly on his injured ankle. Greta hurried ahead, opening the heavy wooden door and ushering them inside. The interior was dark and cold. Fuel was scarce in Austria by early 1945, and the Steinbergs could only afford to heat one small room. But it was shelter, and after the freezing orchard, it felt like salvation. Johann gestured for Hayes to sit at a rough wooden table while Greta examined his ankle. She spoke softly in German. her hands gentle but efficient as she removed his boot and wrapped the swollen joint with strips of cloth. Hayes tried to communicate, pointing to himself and saying his name, but the language barrier seemed insurmountable. What he could understand, however, was the risk these people were taking. Harboring an enemy airman was a capital offense under Nazi law. If the Gestapo discovered Hayes here, the Steinbergs would be executed, their property confiscated, their names erased from the community. Yet here they were, tending to his wounds as if he were their own son. The thought made Hayes uncomfortable. Why were they doing this? What did they want from him? The answer would come later in the attic in whispered conversations that would change everything Hayes thought he knew about war, about enemies, about the capacity of the human heart to transcend grief. That first night, Johann led Hayes up a narrow staircase to the farmhouse attic. It was a cramped space beneath the sloping roof, barely tall enough for Hayes to stand upright at its center. A small window, no bigger than a dinner plate, provided the only light. The attic was filled with the detritus of decades, old furniture, farming tools, trunks of clothing. But in one corner, Johann had cleared a space and laid out a thin mattress, a wool blanket, and a pillow. He pointed to the mattress, then to Hayes, making it clear this would be his hiding place. Then Johann did something that puzzled the American. He walked to an old wooden trunk, opened it carefully, and removed a bundle of letters tied with string. He held them for a long moment, his weathered hands trembling slightly, before placing them on a small table beside the mattress. Johann looked at Hayes with an expression that seemed to carry the weight of the world, then turned and descended the stairs without another word. Hayes sat on the mattress, exhausted and confused. He picked up the bundle of letters, examining them in the dim light from the window. They were written in German, the handwriting neat and precise. But on the back of each envelope, Hayes could make out postmarks: United States of America, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas. These letters had come from America, from POW camps on American soil. Hayes's heart began to race as he realized what he was holding. These were letters from the Steinberg son, a German soldier who had been captured by American forces and sent to a prisoner of war camp in the United States. And Hayes was now hiding in the very room where these letters had been received, read, and treasured. Over the following days, as Hayes's ankle slowly healed and he remained hidden in the attic, the Steinbergs began to trust him more. Greta would bring him food twice a day, always meager portions, bread and thin soup, sometimes a bit of cheese or sausage. Austria was starving by February 1945. The Allied bombing campaigns had destroyed supply lines. The German military had requisitioned most food production, and the civilian population was surviving on rations that barely sustained life. Yet the Steinbergs shared what little they had with their hidden American. Hayes felt the weight of their sacrifice every time Greta climbed those stairs with a bowl of soup. He knew she and Johann were going hungry so he could eat. The guilt was overwhelming. But there was something else too, a growing curiosity about those letters, about the son who had written them, about why these people had chosen to save an enemy airman. One evening, about a week into his concealment, Johann came up to the attic carrying a small oil lamp. He sat down on an old chair across from Hayes and began to speak. His English was broken, heavily accented, learned decades ago in school and rarely used since, but it was enough. Johann pointed to the letters and said one word: Klaus, his son's name, Klaus Steinberg. He had been a soldier in the Wehrmacht, Johann explained haltingly. Not a Nazi, Johann insisted, just a soldier, conscripted like millions of other young German and Austrian men. Klaus had been captured in North Africa in 1943 during the final collapse of German forces there. He had been shipped to America, to a POW camp in Texas. And from there, he had written home. Johann picked up one of the letters, his hands shaking as he unfolded the yellowed paper. He began to read aloud, translating slowly into English as best he could. Klaus's first letters had been cautious, revealing little about his conditions, clearly written with the knowledge that German censors might read them. But as months passed and Klaus realized the Americans were not censoring his mail, his letters became more detailed, more honest. He wrote about the camp in Texas, about the barracks where prisoners slept, about the food they were given. And here was where Hayes began to understand. Klaus had been astonished by his treatment. He had expected brutality, starvation, perhaps execution. Nazi propaganda had told German soldiers that capture by the Americans meant torture and death. Instead, Klaus found himself in a camp where prisoners received 3 meals a day, where Red Cross packages supplemented their rations, where they were allowed to play sports, to stage theatrical performances, to attend religious services. Klaus wrote about American guards who treated prisoners with basic decency, who sometimes shared cigarettes, who looked at the Germans not as monsters but as men who had been caught up in a terrible war. In one letter, Klaus described an American sergeant named Miller who had lost his own brother in the fighting in Italy. This sergeant could have been bitter, could have taken out his grief on the German prisoners. Instead, he had approached Klaus one day and asked about his family, about his home in Austria. They had talked for an hour, 2 men from opposite sides of a war, finding common ground in their shared humanity. Klaus wrote that Sergeant Miller had told him something that changed his perspective. "We are not fighting you. We are fighting the men who sent you to fight. When this is over, you will go home, and maybe we can build something better." Johann's voice broke as he read those words. He looked at Hayes with tears in his eyes and said, "Klaus believed him. My son believed there could be something better, but Klaus never came home." He died in the POW camp in January 1945, just weeks before Hayes bailated out over Austria. Not from mistreatment or violence, but from a sudden illness, pneumonia that swept through the camp during a harsh winter. The American authorities had notified the Steinbergs through the Red Cross. They had sent Klaus's personal effects, including a letter from the camp commander, expressing condolences, and noting that Klaus had been buried with full military honors in a cemetery near the camp. The news had devastated Johann and Greta. Their only son, their only child, was gone. And yet, even in their grief, they had been struck by the respect shown by the Americans. Klaus had not died in a ditch or been thrown into an unmarked grave. He had been treated with dignity, even in death. When Johann finished reading, he looked at Hayes and said something that would haunt the American airman for the rest of his life. "You are someone's son too. Somewhere in America your mother and father are waiting for you to come home. Klaus cannot come home to us, but maybe you can go home to them. That is why we hide you. That is why we share our food. Because your people showed mercy to our son, and now we show mercy to you. This is how we honor Klaus. This is how we break the cycle of hatred." Hayes sat in stunned silence. He had been trained to see the enemy as faceless, as the other, as something less than human. That was how soldiers were made to kill. But here, in this cramped attic, holding letters from a dead German soldier who had been shown kindness by American captors, Hayes confronted the uncomfortable truth that the enemy was just like him. Klaus Steinberg had been a son, a young man with hopes and dreams, someone who had been conscripted into a war he did not start. And now his parents, who had every reason to hate Americans, were risking their lives to save one. The weight of that realization was crushing. Hayes wanted to say something, to express his gratitude, to apologize for the bombs that had fallen on Austrian villages, for the war that had taken Klaus from his parents. But words felt inadequate. Instead, he reached out and took Johann's weathered hand in his own, squeezing it gently. The old man nodded, understanding passing between them without language. They sat together in the lamplight, two men from opposite sides of a war, united by grief and the fragile hope that mercy could transcend hatred. Outside, the wind howled through the alpine valley, and in the distance, the rumble of artillery continued its relentless approach. The war was not over, the danger was not past, but in that moment, in that attic, something profound had shifted. Hayes was no longer just a soldier trying to survive. He was a witness to an act of grace that defied everything war had taught him about enemies and allies. The days turned into weeks. February gave way to March, and still Hayes remained hidden in the Steinberg's attic. The danger grew more acute with each passing day. Gestapo patrols increased in the area as Nazi authorities desperately tried to root out deserters, resistance members, and anyone suspected of disloyalty. Twice, Gestapo officers came to the Steinberg farmhouse, searching for contraband or hidden enemies. Hayes would lie perfectly still on his mattress, barely breathing, listening to the heavy boots on the floor below, to the harsh German voices demanding answers from Johann and Greta. The Steinbergs never wavered. They answered questions calmly, allowed the officers to search the ground floor and the barn, and somehow managed to keep them from climbing the stairs to the attic. How they did this, Hayes never fully understood. Perhaps the Gestapo officers were lazy, or perhaps Johann's age and Greta's frailty made them seem harmless. Or perhaps in those final chaotic months of the war, even the Gestapo were going through the motions, knowing the end was near. Whatever the reason, Hayes remained undiscovered, though each search left him shaking with fear and the Steinbergs pale and exhausted. The psychological toll of hiding an enemy airman while Nazi authorities prowled the countryside was immense. Yet the Steinbergs never once suggested that Hayes leave, never once indicated that the risk was too great. They had made their choice, and they would see it through, no matter the cost. During the long hours alone in the attic, Hayes read Klaus's letters over and over. Johann had given him permission, even encouraged it, perhaps hoping that Hayes would understand the depth of what was being offered. The letters painted a picture of a young man who had been transformed by his experience as a POW in America. Klaus had entered the camp bitter and indoctrinated, believing the Nazi propaganda about American savagery. But month by month, his perspective had shifted. He wrote about conversations with American guards who were just regular guys, farmers and factory workers and college students who had been drafted into service. He wrote about prisoners being allowed to work on nearby farms, earning small wages that they could use to buy cigarettes or candy. He wrote about a Christmas celebration in 1943 where American guards and German prisoners had sung carols together, finding common ground in shared traditions. Most poignantly, Klaus had written about a conversation with an American chaplain, a man who had challenged him to think about what kind of world he wanted to return to after the war. The chaplain had said, "You can carry hatred back to Austria, or you can carry hope. Hatred will rebuild nothing. Hope might rebuild everything." Klaus had been wrestling with that question when he died. And now, in a strange twist of fate, his parents were living out the answer, choosing hope over hatred, choosing to save an American airman because mercy was the only way to honor their son's memory. As March progressed, the sounds of war grew closer. American forces were pushing into Austria from the west, Soviet forces from the east. The Steinbergs' village was caught in the middle, and the civilian population lived in constant fear of being overrun by one side or the other. Refugees from bombed-out cities began streaming through the area, desperate people with hollow eyes and empty stomachs. The Steinbergs had little to offer, but Greta would sometimes share a crust of bread or a cup of water with those who stopped at their door. Hayes watched from his attic window, seeing the human cost of the war in the faces of those refugees. Old men, women, children, all displaced, all suffering. It was a far cry from the clean, abstract war he had fought from the tail gun of a B-17, where the enemy was just targets on the ground, buildings to be destroyed, objectives to be achieved. Here the enemy had faces, had stories, had pain. It was uncomfortable and necessary, this reckoning with the reality of what his bombs had done. Hayes had always believed he was fighting for a just cause, and he still did. The Nazi regime was evil, and stopping it was worth the sacrifice. But that did not erase the suffering of ordinary people caught in the crossfire. The Steinbergs were not Nazis. Klaus had not been a Nazi. They were just people trying to survive a war they did not choose. And now, through an act of extraordinary courage and compassion, they were teaching Hayes a lesson that no military training could have provided. That even in war, humanity could prevail if people chose mercy over vengeance. In early April, Johann came to the attic with urgent news. American forces were less than 10 miles away. The German military was in full retreat, and the local Nazi officials had fled. The war, at least in this corner of Austria, was nearly over, but Johann's face was grave as he delivered this news. The next few days would be the most dangerous. Retreating German soldiers were desperate and unpredictable. Some were surrendering, but others were fighting to the death, and still others were committing atrocities against civilians suspected of disloyalty. If a retreating unit discovered Hayes in the Steinbergs' attic, they might execute all 3 of them on the spot. Johann told Hayes to stay absolutely silent, to not move from his hiding place no matter what he heard. Then the old man did something that surprised Hayes. He handed him a small pistol, an old revolver that looked like it dated back to the First World War. Johann said, "If they come for us, if they find you, you must defend yourself. Do not let them take you. Do not let them hurt Greta." Hayes took the pistol, feeling its weight in his hand. He prayed he would not have to use it. The thought of a firefight in this farmhouse, of putting the Steinbergs in even greater danger, was unbearable. But he also understood Johann's logic. If the worst happened, if a desperate German unit stormed the house, Hayes's only chance was to fight. And if he was going to die, he would die protecting the people who had saved his life. The next 3 days were the longest of Hayes's life. He lay on his mattress in the attic, the pistol within reach, listening to the chaos unfolding outside. Gunfire echoed through the valley, sometimes close, sometimes distant. He heard vehicles rumbling down the road, shouted orders in German, the occasional explosion. Once, he heard screaming from a neighboring farm, a sound that made his blood run cold. He wanted to look out the window to see what was happening, but he did not dare. Any movement, any shadow could give away his position. So he waited, every muscle tense, every sense on high alert. On the second night, he heard heavy footsteps in the farmhouse below. German voices, angry and demanding. Greta's voice, high and frightened, trying to answer questions. Hayes gripped the pistol, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. He heard furniture being overturned, doors being kicked open. The soldiers were searching the house. Hayes moved silently to the attic door, positioning himself so he could fire down the stairs if they came up. He thought about Klaus, about the letters, about the mercy that had been shown. He thought about his own parents in Iowa, who had no idea if he was alive or dead. He thought about Johann and Greta, who had risked everything for a stranger. And he made a decision. If the soldiers came up those stairs, he would not go quietly. He would fight, not just for himself, but for the Steinbergs, for the chance to honor the gift they had given him. But the soldiers did not come up the stairs. After what felt like an eternity, Hayes heard them leave, their voices fading as they moved on to the next house. He collapsed back onto his mattress, shaking with relief and adrenaline. Below, he could hear Greta crying softly, Johann's voice, low and soothing, trying to comfort her. Hayes wanted to go down to thank them, to tell them how sorry he was for putting them through this, but he could not risk it. Not yet. Not until the Americans arrived. The Americans came on April 7, 1945. Hayes heard them before he saw them, the rumble of tanks and trucks, the shouts in English, the unmistakable sound of American voices. He crawled to the attic window and peered out, his heart soaring as he saw U.S. Army vehicles rolling down the road, infantry soldiers moving cautiously through the village, checking houses for holdouts. It was over. He had survived. But his first thought was not relief for himself. It was concern for the Steinbergs. How would the American soldiers react when they found out an elderly Austrian couple had been hiding a U.S. airman? Would they believe the story? Would they think the Steinbergs were collaborators who had been holding Hayes prisoner? He had to make sure Johann and Greta were protected, that their act of mercy was recognized and honored. Hayes made his way down the attic stairs, moving carefully on his still tender ankle. He found Johann and Greta in the kitchen, holding each other, both looking exhausted and relieved. When they saw Hayes, Greta rushed to him, embracing him like a son, tears streaming down her face. Johann gripped his shoulder, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile. Hayes tried to thank them, to find words adequate to express his gratitude, but his voice broke with emotion. All he could manage was, "You saved my life. You did not have to, but you did. I will never forget this. Never." Together, the three of them walked out of the farmhouse and into the orchard where Hayes had first landed 14 weeks earlier. American soldiers were moving through the area, and Hayes flagged them down, identifying himself as a downed airman. The soldiers were astonished. They had assumed Hayes was dead, his name already on the list of missing in action. They wanted to take him immediately to a field hospital to debrief him, to get him back to his unit. But Hayes refused to leave until he had explained what the Steinbergs had done, until he had made sure they would be protected. He spoke to the company commander, a captain from Ohio, telling him the whole story. The letters from Klaus, the decision to hide him, the risks the Steinbergs had taken. The captain listened, his expression softening as Hayes spoke. When Hayes finished, the captain walked over to Johann and Greta and saluted them. It was a gesture of respect, of recognition that what they had done was not just an act of kindness, but an act of profound courage. The captain promised that the Steinbergs would be protected, that their farm would not be requisitioned, that they would receive extra rations to help them recover from the sacrifices they had made. It was a small repayment for an immeasurable debt, but it was something. Before Hayes left with the American soldiers, he returned to the attic one last time. He gathered Klaus's letters, holding them carefully, and brought them down to Johann. He tried to return them, but Johann shook his head. He said, in his broken English, "You keep one. Remember Klaus. Remember that enemies can become friends. Remember that mercy is stronger than hate. Hayes selected a single letter, one where Klaus had written about his conversation with Sergeant Miller, about the hope for something better after the war. He folded it carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket, next to his heart. Then he embraced Johann and Greta one final time, promising that he would write to them, that he would never forget what they had done. As the American convoy pulled away from the Steinberg farm, Hayes looked back through the rear window of the truck. Johann and Greta stood in their orchard, waving, two elderly figures who had chosen compassion over vengeance, who had honored their son's memory by saving an enemy's life. Hayes waved back, tears streaming down his face, knowing that he had witnessed something rare and precious. Proof that even in the darkest times, even in the midst of total war, the human capacity for mercy could transcend hatred and transform enemies into family. Hayes returned to the United States in May 1945, just as the war in Europe ended. He was debriefed extensively, his story documented by military intelligence. But what mattered most to Hayes was keeping his promise to the Steinbergs. He wrote to them regularly, sending packages of food and supplies during the difficult post-war years when Austria struggled to rebuild. He learned more German so he could write to them in their own language. And in 1950, when travel to Austria became easier, Hayes returned to the Steinberg farm with his new wife. Johann and Greta were overjoyed to see him, to meet the woman he had married, to know that the young man they had saved had built a good life. Hayes brought with him a gift, a photograph of Klaus's grave in Texas. American authorities had maintained the POW cemetery with care, and Klaus's grave was marked with a proper headstone, his name and dates clearly inscribed. Hayes had visited the grave before traveling to Austria, placing flowers and saying a prayer for the young man he had never met but who had made his survival possible. Johann and Greta wept when they saw the photograph, grateful that their son rested in a place of honor, that he had not been forgotten. The visit lasted a week, and during that time, Hayes helped Johann with repairs to the farmhouse, worked alongside him in the orchard where he had first landed. It was a form of repayment, inadequate but heartfelt. And it was a way of closing a circle, of transforming a story of war into a story of peace and reconciliation. The Steinbergs lived into their 80s, passing away within months of each other in 1962. Hayes attended their funerals, standing in the small Austrian cemetery as they were laid to rest beside the plot reserved for Klaus, whose body would eventually be repatriated from America and buried with his parents. At the funeral, Hayes spoke about what Johann and Greta had taught him, that mercy was not weakness but the highest form of strength, that choosing compassion in the face of grief was an act of profound courage, that the bonds of humanity were stronger than the divisions of war. His words resonated with the villagers who attended, many of whom had their own stories of loss and survival from the war years. In the decades that followed, Hayes became an advocate for reconciliation between former enemies. He spoke at schools and veterans organizations, telling the story of the Steinbergs and Klaus, challenging audiences to see beyond the labels of friend and enemy. He argued that the true victory of World War II was not just the military defeat of fascism, but the moral choice to rebuild rather than seek revenge, to extend the Marshall Plan rather than impose punitive reparations, to create institutions like the United Nations that aim to prevent future wars. And at the heart of his message was always the example of Johann and Greta Steinberg, two ordinary people who had made an extraordinary choice, who had broken the cycle of hatred by choosing mercy. Hayes kept Klaus's letter for the rest of his life, carrying it in his wallet as a reminder of what he had learned in that Austrian attic. The letter became worn and fragile over the years, the ink fading, but Hayes could recite its contents from memory. He would sometimes take it out and read it to his children and grandchildren, explaining that this letter, written by a German soldier in an American POW camp, had saved his life by inspiring an act of mercy that transcended nationality and grief. His family came to understand that their father's survival was not just a matter of luck or military rescue, but the result of a profound moral choice made by people who had every reason to choose differently. That understanding shaped how Hayes's descendants viewed the world, instilling in them a belief in the power of compassion and the importance of seeing the humanity in others, even those designated as enemies. When Hayes died in 1998 at the age of 76, his family buried him with Klaus's letter, honoring his wish that the two men, one American and one Austrian, who had never met but whose lives had been intertwined by war and mercy, should be remembered together. The story of Robert Hayes and the Steinberg family is not widely known. It did not make headlines, did not become the subject of major films or best-selling books, but it endures as a testament to the capacity of ordinary people to perform extraordinary acts of courage and compassion, to choose mercy over vengeance, to honor the dead by protecting the living. In a war that claimed tens of millions of lives, that saw atrocities and horrors beyond comprehension, this small story of an Austrian couple and an American airman stands as a reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity can prevail. That enemies can become friends, that mercy can be stronger than hate, and that the true measure of victory is not just defeating the enemy but finding the courage to see them as human, to extend compassion even when it costs everything, and to believe that a better world is possible if we choose to build it together, one act of kindness at a time.